Welcome back. Today, we're diving into something pretty wild, a speculative scenario where the world's longest, most peaceful border suddenly looks like a potential front line. So let's just jump right in with this quote because, wow, this is how the whole thing was described. The most devastating blow to American military credibility in decades. I mean, talk about a bombshell. It was apparently a total shock to the system. And the word is that top Pentagon officials were just completely blindsided. So what on earth happened? Well, here it is. On January 22nd, 2026, the story goes that while the US was looking inward, totally wrapped up in its own politics, Canada did the unthinkable. They triggered Article 5. You know, NATO's all-for-one, one-for-all defense pact. But here's the twist. It wasn't aimed at an outside enemy. No. This time, the threat was the United States. And make no mistake, this wasn't just some political statement. This was the real deal. We're talking about activating hard, binding military commitments. Think rapid reaction forces, missile defense systems, entire naval task forces, the whole shebang. And the price tag? A staggering $560 billion in military power, all suddenly lined up to potentially face off against the US. And this is where things get really wild, because you have to understand how big of a deal this is. Article 5 was always about protecting NATO members from an outside enemy, an attack from someone who isn't in the club. But this was the first time in history that one member turned around and successfully used it against another member. It completely flips the entire purpose of NATO upside down. Right, so the big question is, how did we get here? I mean, Canada and the US, two of the closest allies on the planet. To understand it, we have to look back at how things used to be. For literally decades, the relationship was built on this foundation of trust, but also, and this is key, dependency. So for a long, long time, there was this criticism that Canada was kind of a free rider in NATO. The deal is everyone's supposed to spend about 2% of their economy on defense. Canada, they were usually hovering around 1.3%. And why could they do that? Well, because the unspoken agreement was always that, no matter what, the US would have their back. And this really drives home just how deep that dependency went. Think about this. Over 3/4, 78% of Canada's entire defense setup, their planning, their strategy, everything, was built on the assumption that America would always be there. So when that relationship started to go south, Canada found itself with basically zero leverage. They were completely exposed. Then, in 2025, you get this perfect storm of events. Things just started escalating fast. You have a new prime minister in Canada, and at the same time, the threats from the US are getting louder and louder. It all comes to a head with this direct warning from Trump about using the military to settle disputes over Arctic resources. We're not talking about a trade spat anymore. For Canada, this was seen as a genuine threat to their existence. Okay, so while all this public drama is playing out, you have to picture a completely different chess game happening in the background. A much quieter, much more strategic game being played in the halls of power in Ottawa and Brussels, all orchestrated by Canada's new leader. And this new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, wasn't your typical politician. This guy was a central banker. He'd run the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. So he came at this problem with a totally different mindset, a global, strategic view. And his conclusion was simple and direct. Canada could no longer afford to be dependent on one single unpredictable neighbor. That had to change, and it had to change now. So, what was their secret weapon? It was this little-known, almost forgotten NATO protocol called CADA. And get this, it was designed for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario, a way to protect a NATO member from a threat coming from another member. It's basically been described as the alliance's internal nuclear option, a real break glass in case of emergency tool. Now this is the really clever part. Canada didn't just run to NATO screaming for help. No, they played the long game. For 6 months, they methodically, painstakingly built their case. They cited this new security framework that everyone at the time kind of laughed off as just symbolic, but what they were really doing was using it to create a paper trail, formally documenting every single threat. By the end of the year, their case was so solid, so well documented with intelligence and recordings, that when they finally presented it, NATO leadership had no choice but to fast-track it. So the trigger gets pulled. What does that actually mean? What's the so what here? What did Canada get out of this? And what did it cost the US in this brand new version of North America? Well, according to the source material, Canada walked away with 4 ironclad guarantees.
First, direct military support from all 28 other allies. Second, a whole new set of rules for how to handle a threat from inside the alliance. Third, they got access to allied tech and, crucially, intelligence on U.S. military movements. And fourth, a brand new allied command center right there on Canadian soil. The bottom line, on paper at least, America's military dominance in its own backyard was gone, neutralized.
And that command center isn't just for appearances. Its entire job, its reason for existing, is to be able to get battle-ready international troops into Canada in less than 48 hours if the U.S. makes a move. That's not a policy paper, that's a whole new strategic reality, a total game changer. But, and this is a huge but, this wasn't some clean, simple win. Not at all. As the source makes very clear, what Canada did was an enormous, high-stakes gamble. They've basically started a whole new and very dangerous game.
And you can really see the risks here. I mean, think about it. Canada traded being dependent on one powerful country for being dependent on a committee of 30 different countries. And let's be real, NATO is not one single army. Plus, the idea of enforcing this against a superpower like the United States, it's never, ever been tested. And then there's the biggest risk of all, that this whole thing could backfire and actually trigger the very attack it was designed to prevent. And yet, this really gets to the heart of it. Even with all those terrifying, unknown risks on the table, the Canadian government looked at the situation and decided it was worth it. They calculated that the threat from their closest ally had become so big, so real, that even this insane gamble was the better option. I mean, that fact alone tells you everything you need to know about how broken that relationship had become.
So we're left with this really provocative question, aren't we? When your closest ally, the neighbor you share the longest peaceful border in the world with, fears you more than any other enemy on the planet, what is the true cost of your power? It really makes you think.